Tom Coleman's investigation. When New York Times columnist Bob Herbert heard about Tulia, what he found shocked him.
The investigation was a disaster. I mean, this was not an investigation that should have been permitted. And then once you got into court, there should have been a jury who should have seen through this ridiculous, this flimsy evidence. So it became clear to me that, you know, this was a major outrage that was going on.
I didn't think I had a chance of defending apart from finding out something about Coleman, which would provide a basis for defense.
But Paul Holloway and the other local defense lawyers were running out of time and money. They didn't have any solid evidence, and an amateur investigation by a poor farmer was not enough to take to court. They were desperate.
I began to just feel like it was a crisis for me and for my clients, that something had to be done.
Tulia had once been a segregated town with train tracks dividing the races. But today, there's not much left of what was once a thriving black community.
For the first 30 years of my life, all the blacks in town, just pretty well all of them, lived out here across the tracks.
It was just houses, houses, and more houses. A lot of people lived down here, all black, but there was a lot of them.
The days of official segregation may be over, but in Tulia, like many southern towns, blacks and whites may work together, but they keep their social distance.
We coexisted together. In the white community, we would say separate but equal, basically, but we're separate by the choice of the ethnic groups here.
But neither blacks nor whites could help noticing that all of those arrested were black or had ties to the black community. In fact, the drug sweep snared almost 10% of Tulia's 500 African-American residents. And some old stereotypes bubbled up to the surface.
They talk about using drugs like I talk about drinking Coca-Cola or coffee. It's just a matter of fact, just things we do in our society. Not anything wrong with it.
Freddie Brookins Jr. was one of the accused. He said he never sold or even used drugs, but he faced decades in prison. When prosecutors offered him 4 years in return for a guilty plea, Brookins was ready to jump at the deal. But first, he talked to his dad.
I couldn't tell him exactly what for him to do, but I could tell him what I would do. And there's no way in the world I would have stood there and told those people I'm guilty.
And he had asked me, he said, well, son, did you do it? I said, no, sir, I didn't do it. He said, well, why should you plead out to something that you didn't do?
Hoping that the truth would win out, he decided to take his chances in court. Undercover agent Coleman testified that Brookins had offered to sell him powder cocaine. Coleman claimed he bought the drugs outside of Freddie's house. There were no eyewitnesses, and no other evidence produced. No guns, no drugs, no money. None of the evidence recovered routinely in drug busts. And the story was the same for the rest of the defendants.
There were no drugs found, no money to speak of, no weapons. I mean, I've covered criminal justice enough, and I've covered cases involving major drug dealers to know that this is not the way major drug dealers operate.
But in Tulia's courthouse, that didn't seem to matter. Freddie Brookins Sr. tried to prepare his son for the inevitable.
They're gonna find you guilty, and they're gonna give you maximum time.
While I was sitting there waiting to get the verdict, I really just had butterflies. But I also knew that, I was gonna have to come and do some time.
When the jury went in to deliberate, I heard one gentleman with a deep voice stated the fact that they're sitting out there thinking we're gonna give him probation, but we need to give him all the time we can give him. They're nothing but slaves anyway.
Freddie Brookins Jr. was charged and convicted as a first-time offender.
I was sitting there, and as they came in, as all of them filed in, and they gave us the verdict, I really couldn't do nothing, just put my head down.
That family went in the courtroom and watched their son get sentenced to 20 or 25 years in prison. Nobody shed a tear. And then, of course, they all wept afterwards, out of sight of the crowd in the courtroom.
You talk about cut like a knife, now they cut deep. But it was something that we already expected. We knew this was going to happen.
For Tulia's African-American community, the pictures of friends and relatives being led into jail, handcuffed, unwashed, and half-dressed, sent a powerful message. This could only be about one thing: race.
After a few trials, I'm sitting here saying, you know, this is not about drugs or what you've done. It's a racist thing.
I think that it's a racist place. The majority of the townspeople who are white really applauded this investigation, which was focused almost exclusively on the town's black population.
But Tulia's sheriff, Larry Stewart, who had started the investigation in the first place, continued to insist that the operation had been colorblind.
As far as any racial motivation for this operation, there was absolutely none. We did not target any individual or any group of individuals.
The trials and the convictions kept on coming. By early 2000, it was obvious that local defense attorneys desperately needed help. So they turned to an Amarillo attorney named Jeff Blackburn. Blackburn has a reputation as a skilled defender of what seemed like hopeless cases. He agreed to help them.
The first impression was that these folks were getting systematically railroaded by the court down there. But I tried to give them just some practical help in a very narrow way to just defend these cases and figure out what to do. What about?
The more he saw, the more he got involved, working countless unpaid nights and weekends. He chipped away at the mountain of documents in front of him, helped by Gary Gardner's amateur sleuthing to connect the dots. One case that jumped out at Blackburn was that of a man named Yule Bryant.
Yule Bryant never sold Tom Coleman drugs, ever. Yule Bryant was accused of selling Tom Coleman drugs and was arrested on the strength of Coleman's report.
But Blackburn discovered what would be a critical document, an arrest report that seemed to identify the wrong man.
Yule Bryant was completely misidentified.
Yule Bryant in Tom Coleman's original arrest report, was described as tall and bushy-haired. Yule Bryant's about 5'6". At the time, he'd been bald for around 5 years. Clearly not the same man that was on the arrest report.
And then Blackburn found the proverbial smoking gun, a second version of the crime report, one that had clearly been changed to match Bryant's description.
Suddenly, now the identification is correct. In other words, it's Yule Bryant spelled correctly. Yule Bryant, who's now short, and we've eliminated the whole bushy-headed phenomenon.
No one could explain how the second crime report had made it into official files. But Blackburn had his first victory. Prosecutors dropped the charges against Bryant. It was now 2001, a full 2 years after the early morning drug raid. Blackburn didn't think he'd get that lucky again. But then he came across the case of Tanya White. Coleman claimed White had sold him more than 3.5 grams of cocaine. She hadn't been arrested during the subsequent raid because she was out of town and had stayed away. 22 months later, she finally decided to turn herself in and return to Tulia.
I have with me here today Tanya White. She has come back from self-imposed exile for the last 2 years to face justice.
I'm just tired. Like I'm a fugitive from another planet or something, or, you know, an alien or something. I can't come home to visit my family.
You remember me? You really got cute.
Miss White's accused of a crime that could land her in prison for up to 20 years.
I wasn't gonna plea bargain or nothing like that, because I know I didn't never sell any drugs.
White had an alibi. She said she hadn't even been in Tulia at the time of the alleged drug buy.
I had to get all my phone records, utility bills.
But given the prosecution's momentum, Blackburn doubted that Tanya's story alone was going to convince a jury. He needed hard evidence to back up her alibi. evidence he didn't have.
I thought her chances were somewhere between slim and none. Virtually zero at walking away from this thing.
When we return, a legal dream team answers their cry for help. Tanya White returned to Tulia a fugitive, one of more than 40 people accused of dealing drugs. She wanted to clear her name and claimed she had been hundreds of miles away from Tulia at the precise moment she allegedly sold drugs to undercover cop Tom Coleman.
I was living in Oklahoma City when they said that I sold drugs to him. That's like 5.5 hours from here.
But it was Coleman's word against hers, and despite the questions swirling around the arrests, Coleman's word still carried more weight. But just days before the trial was set to begin, attorney Jeff Blackburn got the rock-solid evidence he needed. He found an Oklahoma bank record of an $8 withdrawal made in person by Tanya White. On the very same day Coleman claimed that she had sold him drugs in Tulia. Blackburn's legal assistant, Virginia Cave, followed up on the lead.
The bank statement proved that she could not have been in Tulia on the day in question, that she was 350 miles away. And I think it was within 3 or 4 hours of the time that he said that she sold him drugs. We did the math, couldn't have done it.
Blackburn then moved in to attack Coleman's crime report. In it, Coleman said that Elijah Kelly had witnessed the sale, but now, under oath, Kelly denied it. He also denied witnessing numerous other alleged drug buys.
Well, I wasn't going to get on no witness stand and lie for him and say I had did something when I hadn't did it, or I was with him and I wasn't with him. He claimed that I was with him on numerous drug buys, and most of the times I wasn't with him.
100% of those convictions were obtained on the word of Tom Coleman.
Coleman claimed that he couldn't wear a wire because the community was so tightly knit and he would be in danger of being exposed. He actually testified at trial that he recorded names and dates on his leg with a pen.
Absolutely no backup, no wire, no recording, no surveillance, no photograph, no nothing other than his recollection about what happened.
As I looked at it more closely, you started to find out that there were people who had been targeted who were absolutely innocent. You began to wonder, well, how many of these cases are really tainted? And after a while, how many of these folks are just innocent?
To find out would take more money, more hours, and more help than a few local attorneys could muster. But word of the growing Tulia scandal had reached the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. What had begun as a local drug bust was about to become a major civil rights controversy.
I'm going to be eliciting that testimony.
In the winter of 2002, Vanita Gupta, a lawyer with the Legal Defense Fund, joined the investigation.
The first part of the investigation was getting the court documents, which is what I started doing. I went to the court and spent a lot of time there just kind of going through people's criminal files to try and really figure out what was going on. Yeah, we know very little about this.
Gupta was new to the rough and tumble world of Texas justice and called in reinforcements. A team of young lawyers from some of the nation's top law firms was recruited to work on the case. Almost immediately, they flew into Texas to find out what they could about Tom Coleman.
They just basically threw themselves wholeheartedly into the investigation piece of this case. They actually spent a full week in Texas back in November of 2002.